in the reading and the sermon, I talked about both of those stories. But that time, it was from the Gospel of Mark. And today we're reading from the Gospel of John. But even if you weren't here last week, you might say to yourself, those are really familiar stories. In other words, the miracles lose their punch because we know what to expect. And so we say to ourselves, oh yeah, it would have taken 6 months worth of wages to feed all those people, but Jesus did it with just a little bit of food. Oh yeah, what's the big deal? Or he walked 3 or 4 miles out on a rough lake. Oh yeah, I've heard it all before. We usually view these stories as being a part of the life of Jesus, part of what we know about him, and at least 2 of the stories that we often hear in church or in Sunday school. And we think, oh, those kinds of things would never occur in this day and age. But what if that's not the point? What if the point is not whether or not such events as feeding thousands of people with a little bit of food or Jesus walking on water could occur now? What if that's not the point? What if the takeaway for today is something different? What if the takeaway is this question? Do we expect the unexpected? Do we expect Jesus to show up in our lives at unexpected times and to work among us in unexpected ways? That's really, when you think about it, the theme of today's gospel lesson. And it's also the theme of a story that I read today that reminded me of some of my own experiences. It's a story that's told by Pastor Sharon Myers, I think I've mentioned her before, about a conference that she went to in Quito, Ecuador, when something unexpected happened. So here's how the story goes. She was going to this conference with a group from the University of the South, which evidently is in Tennessee. I don't know that I've ever heard of the University of the South. And because it was a conference, it wasn't a mission project, they stayed in a rather nice hotel. And among the people who went on the conference was a man named Will, who was, by his own admission, an atheist. But Will had a good heart. Will loved all people, and particularly people who he felt had been forgotten. So during the previous year, Will had spent the entire year working in a community that was just outside of Quito. A community that was poor and where there were a lot of people struggling. Well, one day, during the conference, when there was a break, he said to Pastor Myers, "Do you want to see how different life can be just a few hours from here?" And she said, well, yes. And so they stopped at a bakery and they bought out all the bread that they could buy to take to a family of 10 that they were going to visit in this community where Will had worked. They got in a taxi, and very quickly the scenery began to change. And it went from being, pretty plush to pretty depressing. Until they finally reached literally the end of the road. Because the road that a vehicle could take did not go into this community, and they had to get out and walk. So they walked over a dirt path, they came up over a mound of dirt, and there on the hillside, they saw one concrete house with tin roofs stacked on top of another. Now, as she described this, it was a familiar scene to me, and to those of us who went to Guatemala with the church group a few years ago. One house stacked on top of another, almost looking like they're teetering there. And people everywhere. Because she said there was 80% unemployment in that community. As I said, I thought about the Limonada in Guatemala. It looked just like that. But I have to say, every place I've been where there's extreme poverty, the scene has looked something like that. Ramshackle, or at least not very permanent looking homes in Guatemala, in Bolivia, in Israel, in Egypt, in Ghana. People living in the midst of want and need and struggle and violence. And so the scene that she described was to me a familiar scene. And I think I have thought what she thought. She said she looked out at that tableau of these houses that looked like they could fall over any time, and she thought, what is needed here is a bread multiplying miracle of biblical proportions. Now, let's pause there for a minute in her story and go back just for a second to the gospel lesson. What do those two stories of Jesus multiplying the loaves and the fish and Jesus walking on water have in common? Well, scholars would tell you that they point out to us who Jesus is. And of course, the people there thought that he was a prophet. Last week we talked about that they are examples of how Jesus shows compassion. And if I was really mean, I'd ask those of you who were here last week the 6 ways that Jesus showed compassion. But I won't. I made you have multiple quizzes last week during the service. We won't do that this week. But I think, and I said it earlier, that a really important way, especially if we want to apply this to our lives, that these two stories are alike, is that they show Jesus doing unexpected things that touch and change people's lives. So think about Philip for just a minute. I think Philip, do you suppose Philip was an accountant or something? Financial planner? I don't know. I mean, Jesus says to Philip, how are we going to feed all these people? And Philip looks out and says, it would take 6 months' wages to feed all these people. In other words, he knows it's a futile effort right away. And then Andrew comes along with the bread and the fish from the little boy, and he must have known that, you know, he wanted to do something to help, but that he wasn't offering anything that could be truly helpful. I mean, neither of them had any idea what Jesus was going to do. What about that little boy? I always wondered, do you suppose he offered his lunch or was it requisitioned? Whatever the case, can't you just see him thinking, what is this rabbi doing? Here he's blessing my fish and my bread. And then a little while later, there's 12 baskets of food left over. He couldn't have expected that. And then a little later, it says that the disciples were terrified when they saw Jesus walking on the water. Well, duh. I mean, what did that? You think that they're expecting him to walk by and say, hi, fellas, see you on the other side? Of course not. I mean, of course they were terrified. Of course they thought he was an apparition. They couldn't have guessed in 1,000 years that Jesus would come to them walking on the water. And so Jesus continually in Scripture does the unexpected. He shows up in unexpected ways, in unexpected places, does unexpected things, and people are changed. and the stories live on. But you know what? I think it happens all the time, in our day and age as well. And so let's get back to Pastor Heyer's story. She says that they went to the house with the family of 10, and they gave them the bread. And they visited, and of course her Spanish was a little rusty. Will's Spanish was quite good. And as they're talking, she knows enough that she can catch that they're asking Will about his life, but mostly they're talking about God. And this poor Ecuadorian family is saying how God has blessed them, and how much they love God, and how much God loves them, and how they can trust in God to provide for them. And then they point to the bread that Will and Pastor Hires brought, and they say, see, God provided our food for today. We can trust in God to meet our needs. Well, that all was, pretty overwhelming, because they're in the midst of this house with a dirt floor and cement blocks and tin roof and no electricity, no plumbing. And then the mother of the house asked Will to pray. Now, what's a little strange about that? Will's an atheist. So Pastor Hires thought, how's this going to go? So they gathered in a circle, and she said, and Will prayed. She said, oh, did he pray? It was the most beautiful prayer that I think I've ever heard, she wrote. It really, I was so moved by it. I could sense Jesus there. How can that be? Jesus shows up when an atheist prays? And then they got ready to leave, and the people, this family, here they are, gathered in a circle, these two Caucasian North Americans from a wealthy school, 10 Ecuadorians from 3 generations, poor and uneducated. They're all standing together, holding hands, and the atheist is praying. And then they get ready to leave, and the Ecuadorians say what probably were among the only English words that they knew. God bless you. God bless you. God bless you. Over and over again. Hugs and kisses and God bless you. As if they had brought enough food to feed thousands of people. As if God had descended upon them. Which maybe God had. This is what she writes. The entire scene was totally unexpected. We had come to visit them, to let them know we cared, to bring them a little something to eat, to make sure they knew they had not been forgotten. And what we received was the presence of Christ in a circle of people unexpectedly gathered that day. Jesus keeps showing up in unexpected places, in unexpected ways. Now I have to tell you that every place that I have been, and this includes the United States, where people struggle with poverty, with injustice, with illness, with grief, Jesus has shown up in unexpected ways. This week I happened to have a conversation with a man from Guatemala, which along with this story that I read, caused me to think about our trip, our church's trip to Guatemala. How long has that been? 7 years ago?
2007.
2007, okay. And I thought to myself, I know that the men and young men from our group who were building the house in the Limonada, which was an area that was just like what she described, except she didn't say there was gang activity and violence in that town in Ecuador, and there certainly was in the Limonada. And I know that the people who built that house there, David was one of them, Simpson boys were among them. I know that they have stories to tell of how Jesus showed up in unexpected ways. And I know that those of us who were doing a Bible school at the orphanage have stories of the way that Jesus showed up in unexpected ways. But as I thought about that trip this week, here's what came to my mind. We went to a place called Mama Carmen's. Now, I don't know how to describe Mama Carmen's to you, except to say that it was a woman's home. Was it her home? We don't really know, but it seemed to be a home. And she had taken in 50 or more. At least 50 children. Children whose parents weren't able to take care of them, children who had been abandoned, children who needed help. And they were beautiful, and they were funny, and they really loved the toys and the treats that we brought them. We all were touched by those children. But the one that I thought of this week, and I don't know if anyone else will remember him, was a little boy who was in a crib in a room that was removed from where all the activity was. And he had a broken leg, but I suspect he had other problems as well. And I went in to visit him, as did others in the group. And he looked so sad. There was such sadness in his eyes. And he just looked at me with a totally, just a solemn look on his face. And at first I thought, oh, he's so alone. But Jesus showed up. Not in a describable way, not in a measurable way, but in a strong sense that I remember having, that in spite of the fact that he seemed so alone, he wasn't. The presence of Christ was there with him. You know, we face many unexpected events in our lives. And probably more often than not, we view them as being negative. And when we hear stories about bread being multiplied and Jesus walking on water, it's exciting at first, but it loses its punch in the retelling. But at the end of it, what remains is Jesus. And just as he surprised the disciples that day, he surprises us. He shows up among us, among our unexpected moments, and responds to us in unexpected ways. And our lives are changed. I guess the only thing that's truly unexpected is the fact that we don't expect it.